Millionaire cheats on his wife the day she finds out she's pregnant, but the truth about the baby becomes his greatest punishment. Before we start the story, please comment on where you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Christina Bridge woke up that grey morning in London with a strange feeling pressing on her chest, as if the damp air coming in through the ajar windows carried an invisible weight. The fine rain drummed on the glass, a monotonous sound that seemed to echo the restlessness she couldn't explain. The night before, everything had been perfect. She and Charles, her husband, had shared a rare evening of lightness, full of laughter, caresses, and whispered promises about the future. They were anxiously awaiting the outcome of their second attempt at artificial insemination, a process that had sapped their emotional energy over months of consultations, tests, and dashed hopes. The first attempt, months ago, had ended in silent tears and an emptiness that Christina still felt in her bones. This time, however, something seemed different, an intuition she couldn't name, but which kept her awake, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling as Charles slept beside her. The room was cold, the comforter heavy on her body, but she got up slowly, her bare feet touching the icy floor. She wasn't going to work today. The thought of facing the office, her colleagues with their casual questions and endless emails, was unbearable. Her heart was beating too fast, anxiety pulsing through her veins like a distant drum. She needed silence, space to breathe, and process what was to come. She put on a grey bathrobe, the soft fabric hugging her skin, and went down the narrow stairs of the house in Camden Town. The kitchen, small but cozy, smelled of old wood and the coffee she had started to prepare. The strong aroma filled the air, mingling with the sound of the rain that was falling harder now, beating against the windows as if it wanted to come in. Charles had already left. Always punctual, he had left a hasty kiss on her forehead before rushing off to an important meeting in the city centre. "I'll be back later this afternoon, love," he had said, his voice full of an energy that Christina envied. Now alone, the silence of the house seemed to amplify every thought that swirled around in her mind. Sitting at the oak table, a steaming cup in her hands, she stared at the pregnancy test she had bought a few days earlier. It was there, on the linen tablecloth, a simple object that had the power to change everything. What if it came back negative again? The memory of the first disappointment still burned, the muffled cry into the pillow, Charles's hand squeezing hers in mute consolation. But today, something was pushing her forward, an inner voice that whispered, "Try." With trembling hands, she took the test and went to the bathroom. The minutes of waiting felt like an eternity, the ticking of the clock in the room in the distance marking time like a ruthless judge. When she finally looked at the result, her heart stopped for a moment before racing. 2 lines. Positive. She was pregnant. Joy hit her like a warm wave, surging through her chest and bursting into tears that ran free down her face. A shaky laugh escaped her lips, mixed with sobs of relief. After so long, so many nights of uncertainty and fear, she was going to be a mother. She ran to her room, grabbed her cell phone, and almost called Charles, but stopped. No, this deserved more. It deserved a special moment, something he would never forget. With a light heart, she decided to go to the doctor's office to get the official results from the laboratory. She put on a navy blue coat and boots and went out, the cold London wind cutting across her face as she walked through the grey streets. At the laboratory, the receptionist handed her the envelope with a restrained smile. Christina opened it right then and there, her anxious fingers tearing at the paper. Positive, written in black, impersonal letters that, to her, shone like gold. On the way back, the euphoria took her to a shopping centre on Oxford Street. Her eyes lit up when she found a pair of tiny, delicate red shoes, perfect for the baby she already imagined in her arms. She bought them without hesitation, along with a little white gift box and a card. At home, she sat down on the sofa and wrote in the neat handwriting that Charles always praised, "To the most amazing daddy in the world, I can't wait to see you with our little miracle in your arms. Love, Chris." She closed the box with a gold bow and left it on the dining table, her heart dancing with anticipation. The plan was simple: prepare a wonderful dinner, and when the time was right, deliver the gift. He would arrive tired, but she would surprise him with the best news of their lives. The morning passed in a blur of preparations. Christina cooked carefully, the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the house as she roasted a succulent chicken. The rain outside fell in curtains. She sorted out the dishes she was going to use for dinner, put on a jazz playlist in the background, and sorted out a white dress that Charles loved. Everything was in place, the ideal setting for the big reveal. She imagined his smile, his watery eyes, the tight embrace that would follow. She couldn't wait. Around midday, however, an unexpected sound broke her peace. Muffled voices, the front door opening with a click that echoed through the house. Christina frowned, her heart racing. Charles wouldn't be back any time soon. He'd said the meeting would last until late afternoon. Who could it be? A shiver of fear ran up her spine. He imagined a thief, someone taking advantage of the rain to break into unsuspecting houses. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy vase from the shelf and ran to hide behind the living room door, her pulse pounding in her ears. Footsteps approached, accompanied by low laughter, all too familiar. Peeking through the crack, she saw Charles coming in, his hair damp from the rain, his arm around Liz, her neighbor and best friend. Liz knew everything. Of the inseminations, of the fights Christina hid from the world, of the nights she cried on her shoulder telling her of her anguish. They were like sisters, or so Christina thought. Now there they were, kissing with an intimacy that cut like a knife, Charles's hands sliding down Liz's back as she laughed, light and carefree. The vase slipped out of Christina's hands, shattering on the floor with a noise that made them both turn around. Charles saw her, his face frozen in panic. "Chris, it's not what you think," he stammered, releasing Liz as if she were on fire. Liz, flustered, ran to pick up the clothes that were already scattered on the floor, hurriedly getting dressed while mumbling something incoherent. Christina didn't move. Shock gripped her, the world spinning in slow motion around her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were leaden, her eyes fixed on the betrayal that was destroying everything. After a silence that seemed eternal, she spoke, her voice shaky but firm. "I'm pregnant, Charles. That's what I was going to tell you at dinner tonight." The words fell heavy in the air and his face lost all color. Liz, now dressed, ran out the door without looking back. Charles took a step towards her, his hands raised in supplication, but Christina stopped him with a gesture. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice broken. Without another word, she turned her back and left, leaving the gift box and the food being prepared in the kitchen. The streets of London swallowed her up, the rain soaking her clothes as she walked aimlessly. She didn't take a coat or a bag. She just walked, the shock numbing the pain that was beginning to set in. Her steps took her to Regent's Park, where she sat on a wet bench, the cold cutting into her skin. There, alone, she touched her belly and whispered, "You're all I have now, I'll protect you." The tears came, hot and silent, mixing with the rain that fell without stopping. Hours later, shivering with cold and exhaustion, she knocked on the door of her sister Emma's house in Notting Hill. Emma welcomed her without question, wrapping her in a warm hug and offering her a steaming cup of tea. Between sobs, Christina unburdened herself. The pregnancy, the betrayal, the emptiness that consumed her. Emma listened in silence, promising to support her, and in that gesture Christina found a sliver of consolation. But the wound was deep, a cut that she knew would take time to close. Christina didn't return to the house she shared with Charles. Shivering with cold and pain, she asked Emma to fetch her things. "I can't face him, Em. Please go there for me," she whispered, wrapped in a blanket on her sister's sofa. Emma nodded, her eyes full of concern and determination. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to. I'll sort everything out." That afternoon, Emma went to Camden Town. Charles was there, his face haggard, his eyes the red of sleeplessness. "Emma, please let me talk to her. I made a mistake, but I love Christina." "It was a stupid mistake with Liz," he begged, his voice hoarse. Emma stared at him coldly. "You destroyed her, Charles." "A mistake? You brought Liz to their house on the day she was going to tell you about the baby. There's no going back." Without leaving room for retorts, he took Christina's clothes, some books, and the essentials, leaving Charles alone with his guilt. Back in Notting Hill, Christina tried to pull herself together. Emma was her safe haven, looking after her with hot tea and cozy silence. Charles bombarded her cell phone with messages, apologies, pleas, promises, but Christina ignored them, finally blocking him. Liz, meanwhile, had disappeared. Neighbors said she had locked the house and left, perhaps to escape the chaos she had helped to create. Christina didn't know whether to hate her or feel sorry. Liz's betrayal hurt almost as much as Charles. Days passed in a haze of sadness. Christina hardly left her room, her body heavy, her mind spinning between anger and relief at having her baby as an anchor. Emma encouraged her gently. "You're stronger than you think, Chris. This baby needs you in one piece." Touching her belly, Christina murmured, "We'll be fine, just the two of us." A week later, the phone rang. It was the fertilization clinic, the secretary's voice tense. "Mrs. Bridge, we need you to come here urgently. The doctor has something important to discuss." Christina felt a tightness in her chest. What else could go wrong, she thought, but agreed. She dressed with effort, her body still heavy with exhaustion, and took the subway to the doctor's office. In the cold room, Dr. Thompson greeted her with an embarrassed look. "Mrs. Bridge, there was a serious error on the day of your insemination," he began hesitantly. Christina frowned, her heart racing. "What kind of mistake?" "Due to a mix-up in the records, the semen used was not that of your husband. It was from a donor who had requested a surrogate. The other patient didn't show up, and by mistake you received his material. Charles's semen is still stored here." Silence filled the room. Christina blinked, processing the words. The baby wasn't Charles. It was a stranger's. But instead of despair, a wave of relief washed over her, warm and unexpected. The doctor continued nervously. "The clinic takes full responsibility. We are available for any support or repairs." Christina interrupted him, her voice firm. "That's the best news I've received in the last few days." Dr. Thompson stared at her, perplexed. "What do you mean?" Christina took a deep breath, a bitter smile appearing. "My husband cheated on me the day I found out I was pregnant. Knowing that this baby isn't his frees me. He no longer has anything to do with me or my child." The doctor nodded, still confused, as Christina stood up, light for the first time in days. Leaving the clinic, Christina walked to the banks of the Thames. The grey river reflected the cloudy sky, but she no longer felt the weight that was suffocating her. The cold wind hit her face and she touched her belly, whispering, "It's just us now, and that's enough." The baby was hers, free from the bonds of Charles, that scoundrel who had destroyed her trust. For the first time, she saw a possible future, a fresh start. At Emma's house, she told her sister everything. "I can't believe they made such a mistake," said Emma, hugging her. "But you're okay with it?" Christina nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I am. This baby is mine, only mine. Charles has no more power over me." That night, however, a phone call broke the calm. An unknown number. Christina answered, and a deep, mysterious male voice said, "You need to know the truth about your baby." Before she could answer, the call dropped. Her heart raced. Who was that man? The donor. And what truth was he hiding? Through the window, the rain continued to fall, as if London held secrets that she still had to face. Christina's phone rang again that morning, but this time she recognized the number. It was Charles. Her heart leapt, not from excitement, but from anxiety. He had been trying to get in touch for days, sending short messages, asking to talk. Christina knew she couldn't put it off any longer. Sitting on the sofa, her cell phone trembling in her hands, she took a deep breath and began to type. The words came out quickly, almost like a relief. "Charles, I need to tell you the truth. The baby isn't yours. It was a mistake by the clinic. I'm sorry about everything, and you can live your life without worrying about it." She pressed send and threw the phone on the edge of the sofa, as if to get rid of the weight it was carrying. Minutes later, the phone vibrated with a dry reply. "That's impossible. Answer me. Do I want to know more or go straight to the clinic?" After that, silence. Charles no longer insisted. A few days later, while Christina was still trying to process the void left by Charles's departure from her life, the phone rang again. It was the clinic. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost nervous. "Mrs. Christina, we need you to come here. The donor, the baby's biological father, he wants to talk to you. He found out about the child and says he's interested in it, since the semen is his." Christina felt the floor disappear. A new dilemma was forming in front of her. She had no intention of giving up the child she was carrying, but now there was someone else, a stranger, claiming the same right. The clinic arranged a meeting for the two of them to get to know each other. Christina spent the night sleepless, her stomach churning with the nausea of pregnancy and the fear of what was to come. Emma, her sister, was the only one who accompanied her. On the way, Emma held her hand and said, "You're not alone in this. Let's face it together." Christina nodded, but the heaviness in her chest didn't subside. When they reached the clinic's meeting room, Christina saw the man for the first time. Edward Harrington was his name, as the receptionist introduced him. At 35, he was incredibly handsome, tall, with well-combed brown hair and piercing green eyes. But his beauty was overshadowed by an aura of arrogance. He entered the room accompanied by a lawyer, a man in an impeccable suit carrying a briefcase full of papers. Edward barely looked at Christina before he spoke, his voice firm and cutting. "I am the biological father of this child. I won't give up my rights. I want to know how we're going to resolve this." Christina, with Emma by her side, felt the blood rise to her face. She had no lawyer, no millions in the bank, but she had something that no one could take away from her, her determination. "I'm the mother," she said, staring at Edward. "I'm carrying this baby. I'm going to look after it, and I'm not going to give up my son to you or anyone else." The atmosphere in the room became tense, almost suffocating. Edward's lawyer started talking about laws and contracts, but Christina wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on Edward, who stared back at her with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. After long minutes of exchanging arguments, Edward raised his hand, interrupting his lawyer. "Enough," he said, still looking at Christina. "I'll think of something. I'll contact you directly." He stood up, followed by the lawyer, and left the room without saying another word. Christina stood there, paralyzed, while Emma squeezed her shoulder in silence. What could that man think? What if he decided to fight for the baby with all his money and power? Over the next few days, Christina sank into a sea of desolation. Charles, whom she had once considered her safe haven, was out of the picture. She heard from mutual friends that he had gone away, perhaps to forget all about it. But the emptiness he left behind was nothing compared to the fear that now consumed her, losing her son to Edward Harrington, a rude and overbearing millionaire she barely knew. The thought of having to share custody with someone like that terrified her. To make matters worse, her health was becoming increasingly fragile. Pregnancy combined with stress caused her blood pressure to plummet and the nausea to leave her exhausted. A few times she had to be hospitalized, spending nights alone in hospital while Emma rushed between work and visits. "I wanted to stay longer," Emma would say, her eyes watering, "but I can't lose my job." Christina understood, but that didn't make the loneliness any less painful. As the days passed, she spent the nights awake, one hand on her belly, whispering to the baby, "You're mine. No one will take you away from me." Her determination was unshakable, but the future seemed more uncertain than ever. Edward Harrington, with his wealth and power, was a real threat. Christina knew he wouldn't give up so easily. The meeting at the clinic had only been the beginning, and she sensed that a bigger battle lay ahead. The rain was falling lightly on the rooftops of Notting Hill when Christina returned from the hospital to Emma's house, enveloped in an almost sacred silence. The cozy walls of the small apartment seemed to have shrunk since the last time she had been there, as if they now knew that inside her there was more than pain. There was a life, a thread of hope, a presence that pulsed strongly, even in the midst of exhaustion. Alone, Christina dragged herself to the sofa, her eyes heavy from a night's sleep, her body tired from the pregnancy and the scares her unstable health had caused her. Emma had left her hot soup and a folded blanket, along with an affectionate note. "I'll be back before dinner. Call me if you need me. I love you." She smiled weakly, grateful, but there was an emptiness, a growing feeling that maybe it wasn't enough. Not anymore. The phone rang and her heart leapt. For a second she thought it was Charles, but the number was different. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was firm, but there was an almost soft note in it. "Christina, it's Edward." She straightened up on the sofa, holding the handset with both hands as if she was going to slip. "What do you want now?" "I want to talk to you, alone, without lawyers, just the two of us." He took a deep breath. "We are both parents of this child, and as much as everything started out wrong, we both have an interest in raising this baby with love and presence." Christina remained silent. For a moment, She wanted to hang up, but there was something in his voice, not arrogance, not a threat, just an attempt. "Are you at your sister's?" he continued. "Can I come over? Not to argue, just to talk. Send me the address. Let's play a joke on those who only read the comments. Write pizza below and only those who have come this far will understand." She didn't reply immediately, but something in her chest was pushing her forward. She couldn't do it all alone. Maybe she needed to make a break for it. Just one. "You can come." Edward arrived about an hour later. He brought no flowers or presents, just him, dressed in a grey overcoat, his face marked by the wind and a look that Christina still couldn't decipher. When he came in and saw Christina sitting, curled up on the sofa with the blanket over her legs and a glass of tea in her hands, something in him seemed to shudder. He took off his coat slowly, as if he didn't want to frighten her, and approached. "Were you in hospital today and you're alone?" he asked, worried. Christina nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, I arrived today." Edward frowned, walking over to her, but stopping at a safe distance. "That's not right." His voice was now deep, almost protective. "You're weak, you're pregnant, that child needs looking after. And so do you." She arched an eyebrow with a shade of irony. "And you're going to look after me? Don't worry, I'm fine." He lowered his head for a moment, and when he looked up, there was sincerity in his eyes. "Yes. I don't know if you believe me, but I want to try and make this right. I've spoken to my lawyer. I've taken the clinic to court. They'll pay for their mistake. But there's nothing else to do but look forward. Resolve this in the best possible way, and with respect." Christina felt something waver inside her. It wasn't trust, not yet. But maybe a start. "What do you want, Edward?" He pulled up a chair and sat down facing her. "I want you to come and live in my house." She widened her eyes in surprise. "What?" "You and the baby need stability. There you'll have a nurse, proper nutrition, medical care, security. A room of your own, no obligations, no commitments. Once the child is born and after the first few months, we can calmly decide how to organize everything. I don't want to take your child away. Not now, not later. But I want to be there and I want you to be well." Christina squeezed the cup between her hands. "That sounds unlikely, but it is possible." He leaned in a little. "I'm the biological father, yes, but I recognize that you're the one facing everything. This pregnancy, this pain, this loneliness, you shouldn't be going through this alone. It's just an invitation. You choose." She didn't answer, but her eyes moistened. For the first time, Edward didn't seem like an enemy. He seemed like a man trying to fix what he could. When Emma entered the house earlier than planned, she was startled to see Edward standing there. "What's going on here?" she exclaimed, dropping her bag on the floor. Christina got up slowly and went to meet her sister. "Calm down, Em, he just came to talk. He made me an offer." Emma crossed her arms, looking from one to the other suspiciously. "What offer?" "He wants me to move in with him." Christina took a deep breath. "He said he'd arrange everything. Bedroom, care, just until the baby is born and the first few months have passed." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "You're going to accept?" Christina looked at her tenderly. I'm so tired, and you're already doing so much. I don't want to be a burden. I promise I'll come here at weekends and spend time with you. But maybe it's best now. Just for now." Emma looked at her, then at Edward, and after a long silence, sighed. "As long as you're okay, I support it." The next morning, the two of them packed their suitcases in complicit silence. Christina chose a few clothes, some books, and a photo album. When Edward arrived to pick them up, the sisters hugged each other for a long time. "If anything happens, you call me." "Any time," whispered Emma. Christina nodded, her eyes watering. And so, together, they set off with Edward into the unknown. Edward's mansion was on the outskirts of Hampstead, surrounded by ancient trees and an imposing iron gate. As the car entered the long, cobbled driveway leading up to the house, Christina and Emma stood in silence, absorbing the impact. The building was majestic, made of light stone with tall windows and warm lights that shone even in daylight. As they entered, they were greeted by a smiling housekeeper with grey hair and kind eyes. "Miss Christina, Miss Emma, welcome. I'm Margaret. This is your home now." Edward escorted them upstairs, through wide corridors decorated with discreet works of art and fine wooden furniture. "This will be your room, Christina." He opened a double door, revealing an elegant room with pale blue curtains, a spacious bed, an armchair by the window and a small desk with fresh flowers. Christina tried to speak, but her voice failed her. "And next door, the support room, with a bathroom. When the baby is born, a nurse will come every other day." He turned to her. "If you need anything at all, just ask." Christina looked around, feeling the weight of everything that was changing. Edward had offered shelter, but also a gesture of peace. Perhaps the first between the two of them. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Edward." He sketched a restrained smile. "I'm just trying to do the right thing." Christina stared at him. And in that instant, for the first time, she saw him not as the stranger from the clinic, nor as the arrogant millionaire, but as a man trying to be a father. The night fell slowly over the Harrington mansion, spreading a deep silence through the old stone corridors, as if even the walls wanted to respect the moment of respite Christina was finally experiencing. It was her first night there, the first since the chaos, since the pain, since the ruins. And surprisingly, there was a strange peace inside her. In the pale blue room, the curtains swayed in the gentle breeze, carrying the scent of freshly picked roses from the garden. Christina lay down, her body still tired, but light in a new way. On the bedside table, a tray with chamomile tea and cookies left by Margaret before she left. Next to it, a small note written in firm handwriting. "If you need anything during the night, just ring the bell next to the bed." The gesture, simple though it was, made her close her eyes with a lump in her throat. There was care, there was attention, things that for so long had been replaced by empty promises and painful silences. In the early hours of the morning, she woke up once, because of a vague dream, and noticed a light on downstairs. Curious, she put on her robe and went downstairs slowly. She peeked through the crack in the office door and saw Edward sitting at his desk, illuminated only by the faint light of a lamp. He was staring at the unlit fireplace, his gaze distant, as if he were hearing echoes that no one else could hear. Christina went upstairs in silence. She didn't want to interrupt, but something struck her. He seemed alone, very alone. Over the next few days, she began to explore the rooms of the mansion, trying to fill the empty spaces with something other than silence. She spent more time with Margaret, who taught her the names of the former employees. Peter, the Scottish gardener with few words. Helena, the Portuguese cook with miraculous hands. Carla, the obstetric nurse who came every other day and became almost a confidant. Christina felt alive walking among the trees in the garden, observing the details of the marble fountain, getting to know the upstairs corridors, touching the books in the huge library. There was warmth in that place, perhaps not from Edward, but from the life she was trying to rebuild. Edward, on the other hand, was a constant presence and absent at the same time. He worked late, locked in his office. He left early. He hardly ever smiled. But every day, without fail, he would ask, "How are you feeling today, Christina?" There was a constancy in this gesture, a sincere concern disguised as formality, and little by little she began to notice the signs. He asked the nurse to keep a detailed health report on her. He authorized special purchases for her food. He installed a more ergonomic armchair in her room after learning that she had back pain. Small details, but they said a lot. Christina found herself living a paradox, protected, but emotionally confused. One afternoon, alone in her room, she opened her cell phone. She had been avoiding social media for weeks, but curiosity, or perhaps the need to shut out ghosts, overcame her. She opened Instagram. The shock came like a cold wave. There was Charles and Liz, together, assumed, photos in an Italian restaurant, smiles in love, couple captions. The most recent caption read, "With her, I found peace. Thank you for healing me." The air escaped from Christina's chest. How could someone be so cruel? How could they pretend that nothing had happened, that they hadn't destroyed her life, her trust, her nights of crying into her pillow? She felt a tear run down her cheek, not because she still loved him, but for the betrayal, for the memory of what she had believed she was living, for the absence of regret in the images. Without thinking twice, she deleted her social networks. She didn't want any more access to pain. She didn't want any more shadows on her path. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of fine rain hitting the window. Edward knocked softly on the door, and entered with a cup of coffee in his hand. "Good morning, Edward. Are you ready?" Christina smiled slightly. "Today is the day of the consultation." "Yes. We're going to find out if the baby is going to be a mini you or a mini me," he said with a shy smile. They walked together to the clinic in silence all the way. The atmosphere was tense, not of disagreement but of something unsaid, as if something new was brewing between them. But they were both afraid to name it. In the ultrasound room, the doctor slid the device over Christina's belly. The image of the baby appeared on the screen, and the sound of the heart beating filled the room like an ancestral drum. "Do you want to know the sex?" the doctor asked. Christina looked at Edward, who nodded. "It's a boy." The world stopped for a second. A boy. Christina put her hand to her mouth in emotion. Edward, seized by an impulse that surprised him even more than it did her, wrapped her in a hug. Strong, warm, sincere. She froze for a second. Edward was hugging her. "It's a boy, Christina," he whispered, his voice breaking. She felt her heart beat faster. Something in that hug stirred everything. It wasn't just celebration. It was something more. Something she didn't know how to handle. When he released her, his eyes were moist, and so were hers. In the car, the silence between them was different this time. Full. Electric. That night, Christina lay down and couldn't sleep. She thought about the baby, the hug, the way Edward looked at her. And then, over the next few days, everything began to change subtly. Edward started having dinner with her, sometimes asking her about books, about her favorite recipes, about her childhood. Christina would tell him and he would listen, as if he wanted to memorize every bit of her world. She began to observe him more, the way he tensed up on the phone, how he got lost in thought looking out of the window, the way he sometimes wiped his hand on his wedding ring, which he no longer wore but whose habit persisted. In one of these conversations, Christina asked, "Have you ever been married?" He hesitated. "Yes, 4 years ago. She left." Christina didn't ask any more. She just felt something break inside her at that moment. One evening, when Margaret had a family emergency and left early, Christina offered to take care of dinner. She prepared a simple but cozy dish. When Edward arrived, exhausted, and smelled something coming from the kitchen, he frowned. "You cooked?" She smiled. "Just a little cuddle. You looked like you needed it." He looked at her as if he saw something he couldn't understand. Then he smiled. A full smile. For the first time. They had dinner together. They laughed. And at the end of the evening, he held her hand on the table for a second longer than necessary. Christina went upstairs with her heart racing. The Saturday sun touched the garden of the mansion with a delicacy rare in London. The rays filtered through the ancient trees, playing on the freshly cut grass as if the place wanted, for a few hours, to forget the pain of the world. Christina walked slowly among the flowers, one hand on her belly, which was beginning to round out, the other holding Emma's hand. The two of them walked barefoot, laughing at childhood memories, as if for a moment reality could be put on hold. Emma had come for the day as promised. She had brought a carrot cake, some magazines, and that big sister look that Christina always needed, the one that said, "I'm here no matter what." They sat on a stone bench in the shade of a cherry tree. "You look different," Emma commented, tilting her head to observe her better. "A bit confused." Christina gave a shy smile. "Yeah, I am." Emma waited. She knew her sister needed time to put into words what she was feeling. "Sometimes I think Edward is getting closer to me," Christina murmured, looking up at the treetops, trying to avoid her sister's gaze. "But I don't know if it's all in my head. Maybe I'm just needy, vulnerable." Emma squeezed her hand. "That could be. Or maybe he really is. And you have every right to feel, to allow yourself to feel. You've been through so much." Christina lowered her eyes. "I was so silly, Em. With Charles. With Liz. I trusted too much. I loved too much. I closed my eyes to such obvious signs." "No, you were only truthful," Emma replied firmly. "That's never silly. They didn't deserve it." Before they could continue, firm footsteps approached. Edward appeared with his hands in his pockets, a slight smile on his face. "Now that you're here, Emma, I thought we could use your help deciding on our son's name." Emma laughed. "I thought you already had something in mind." Christina shook her head. We haven't managed to decide anything yet." "Actually," Edward said, his eyes fixed on the floor, "there's a name that means a lot to me." They both fell silent, attentive. "I really wanted to have a male child to honor my father. His name was Henry." There was a respectful silence. "It was just the two of us," Edward continued, his voice breaking slightly. "He was everything to me, my hero, my best friend, my reference point. He taught me everything. To love, to respect, to fight for what matters. My mother, I never knew." He took a deep breath. "I think that's why I decided to go ahead with the surrogacy. I wanted a son, a boy, to live with him what I lived with my father. I didn't think I needed a mother." Christina felt her chest tighten. Emma lowered her eyes, moved. "But now things have changed," Edward said, looking away, as if that confession was too heavy. Suddenly he stood up. "I'm sorry. I need to sort things out at the office." And he left without looking back. The rest of the afternoon passed lightly, but Christina carried that moment in her heart. Edward's revelation had touched her deeply, more than he could have imagined. In the evening, after Emma left, silence settled over the mansion again. Christina sat in her room for a while, reading her prenatal notes. But her mind wasn't there. She was thinking about Edward. With light steps, she walked down the silent corridor and stopped in front of the office door. She knocked softly. "May I come in?" Edward was sitting, his eyes lost in papers, but he nodded. Christina entered slowly, closing the door behind her. "I wanted to thank you for today, for sharing that about her father." He looked up, surprised by the delicacy of her approach. "I'm glad you told me." Christina approached the sofa and sat down, looking around. "And I wanted to tell you that our son is going to have a mother, a present mother, a strong mother, a loving mother. I'm going to give it my all. Everything." He watched her for a moment. Then he got up, went to a shelf and took down an old album. "There are few photos, but they're the ones that remain." He sat down next to her on the sofa, and Christina carefully pulled out the album, feeling the warmth of his legs rubbing against hers. That simple touch seemed to ignite something between them. The photos showed a smiling man, with strong arms and a kind gaze. Christina turned the pages carefully, touched by the pride visible in Edward's eyes. "You two look so much alike," she said, her voice soft. "He was everything to me," Edward replied in a whisper. Their gazes met. For a few seconds no words were spoken. The silence was dense, electric, full of meaning. Christina felt her heart beat faster. So did he. She could see it. But then, as if realizing what was about to happen, Edward stood up abruptly. "I'm going to get other things. I have some more in the safe." Christina stood there with the album on her lap, her heart warm, confused, tender. Edward returned with a small box, sat down again, this time closer. They started looking through the memories together, and gradually the conversation slipped into childhood stories, old dreams, likes and dislikes. Time passed without them realizing it. Dawn came with a comfortable silence. Christina leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for all this." Edward smiled and for the first time ran his hand slowly through her hair. She closed her eyes, and there, on the office sofa, she fell asleep on his lap. He didn't move. He just stood there stroking her hair, like someone looking after something too precious to be interrupted. The sun was just beginning to rise when Margaret entered discreetly with a tray of tea and froze when she saw the scene before her. Christina was asleep on Edward's lap, and he was smiling. But it wasn't just any smile. It was the kind of smile that says everything that words are still afraid to say. And there, in the silence of that golden morning, without anyone knowing, something was being born. The sun shone timidly into the old wooden room, through the thin office curtains and landing softly on Christina's face. She stirred slowly, still wrapped up in the warmth of that moment, feeling the steady breathing under her head. When she opened her eyes, it took her a moment to realize where she was. She was lying down, on Edward's lap, and he was still there, sitting on the sofa, his eyes half open, as if he hadn't dared to move all night so as not to wake her. When Christina slowly raised her head and realized what had happened, she was paralyzed for a second. "My God, did I sleep here?" she whispered, embarrassed and surprised. Edward, with a tired half-smile on his lips, let out a low laugh. "You slept soundly." And to be honest, I nearly lost my arm. He wiggled his shoulder with an amused grimace. But it was worth it. Christina laughed a hearty, light laugh. It was the first time in a long time that she had laughed like that. A laugh free of pain. "I'm sorry, Edward. I didn't even see the time go by." She stood up slowly, straightening her dress. But as soon as she set foot on the floor, the world spun. A sudden dizziness made her waver. Edward was quick. He held her waist firmly, preventing her from falling. "Hey, calm down. Are you all right? I think I got up too quickly. Or maybe it's the baby telling me that sleeping on the sofa isn't a good idea," she said, smiling weakly. He looked at her with concern, but also with a care that went beyond what was expected. He put his arm around her back and said, "Come on, I'll take you to your room. You should rest a bit more." Christina nodded without protesting. Her body was still limp, her mind confused, but there was something comforting in Edward's touch, not just physical, but emotional. They walked slowly up the stairs. When they reached the bedroom, he helped her sit on the edge of the bed. Christina took a deep breath, grabbed the shoulders of her dress and tried to reach the button at the back but couldn't. She paused and looked at him. She paused and looked at him with a shy smile. "Can you?" She turned on her back, pushing her hair to one side. Edward moved closer. His fingers gently touched the button, slowly unbuttoning it. Her skin shivered at the soft touch, and he hesitated for a moment, as if absorbing the texture of her skin, her breath, the moment between them. His fingers followed down to the second button, then the third. When he had finished, his hand remained there for a moment too long. Christina didn't move. She was surrendered to that silence that said more than 1,000 words. The dress slid slowly down her shoulders, falling to her waist. Her bare back revealed warm skin, fragile and firm at the same time. Edward, as if he couldn't help it, leaned in and brushed his lips against the base of her neck. A light kiss. Then another, lower down. Christina sighed, feeling her whole body surrender to that touch. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, gluing his body to hers. Christina closed her eyes, absorbing the warmth, the smell, the affection. She turned slowly, her eyes seeking his. Edward's gaze was intense, full of restrained feeling, pure desire and something more, something she didn't know if it was love, but which already felt very much like it. Their lips met with urgency and tenderness, in a kiss full of emotion and desire. It was as if all the silence they had shared for weeks exploded there, between mouths that sought each other with longing for a future that didn't even exist yet. Edward carried her in his arms slowly, as if she were made of something rare and precious. He carefully laid her on the bed, her dress being left behind on the wooden floor. Christina touched his face with both hands and pulled him closer. The words disappeared. They made love like someone building a shelter, like someone finding solid ground after a storm. The touches were intense but gentle. Their eyes remained open, locked on each other, as if they were signing an invisible pact of surrender and new beginnings. When it was all over, Christina laid her head on his chest. Her heart was still racing. Her fingers traced circles on his skin. "Now can you give me a bath too?" she asked, smiling, with that sweetness that only appears when the soul is light. Edward laughed, surprised and delighted. Of course, it would be an honor. He led her into the bathroom, where the hot steam was already beginning to fog up the mirror. They stepped into the shower together, laughing and kissing. It was a simple moment, but full of meaning. For the first time in a long time, Christina felt wanted, safe, whole. Outside, Margaret came in with clean sheets and a tea trolley. As she approached the bedroom and heard the laughter coming from the bathroom, she froze for a moment. She leaned her head against the door, smiled, and whispered softly, "Finally." And then he stepped back, leaving them in the new world they were beginning to create. Christina and Edward came out of the shower hours later, still laughing and looking at each other shyly, like two teenagers rediscovering love. They got dressed in silence, but the language of their gestures and touches said everything they didn't dare to say. Later, sitting side by side in the garden, their bare feet touching the damp grass, Christina looked at the horizon. "Do you think this can work?" Edward turned to her. He touched her face with his fingertips, brushing a damp lock of hair away from her forehead. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I want to try. With you." She smiled. For the first time in a long time, That smile held hope. The morning sun tinged London with golden hues when Christina left the mansion to meet Emma in a charming cafe in the centre, where they had arranged a casual lunch, although Christina's heart was boiling. She had hardly slept at night, reliving every second of what had happened with Edward. The memory of the touch, the kiss, the surrender, the laughter in the bath. Everything still vibrated in her like a song she didn't want to end. Emma was already waiting for her at a corner table with a broad smile on her face. When Christina approached, her sister's eyes lit up. She didn't need to say anything. Christina was already different, radiating something new. "It's all over your face, Chris," Emma said, laughing. "Tell me." Christina bit her lips, thrilled. "It happened. Yesterday. Both of us. It was beautiful, Emma. So natural. It wasn't just physical. It was more than that." Emma put her hands to her mouth and let out an excited squeal, attracting the attention of the other customers, but not caring. "I knew it. I knew he was going to give himself up." Christina laughed. "And so did I. I gave myself up. For the first time in so long, I felt whole, safe, loved, even though he hadn't said it yet." Emma clasped her hand over the table. "That's love, Chris. Sometimes love speaks first with gestures." Christina nodded, with tears in her eyes. "And tonight, I want to surprise him." Emma arched her eyebrows, curious. "What are you up to?" Christina smiled enigmatically. That afternoon, Christina walked the streets of London with her heart pounding, guided by an idea that had been growing inside her ever since she heard Edward talk about her father. She went into specialist stores and carefully chose every piece, every color, every detail. The baby's trousseau was almost complete, but she wanted something new. Something with the name Henrique embroidered on every dress, blanket and cushion. She wanted to give Edward the certainty that his son would also be an extension of his story. When she returned to the mansion, her bags full and her heart overflowing, she asked Margaret to help her and arranged everything in the baby's room. The little suite next to his room now seemed magical. Shades of light blue and cream, a mobile with elephants over the crib, little clothes embroidered with Henrique hanging on wooden hangers. Everything was done with love. At nightfall, Edward arrived. His shoulders were tense and his face tired, but his eyes always looked for her first. When Christina appeared at the door with a mysterious smile, he knew something was waiting for him. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He followed without question. As he entered the baby's room, he stopped. His eyes scanned the space, the details. He saw the name, Henrique, everywhere. And then he went still. Christina approached, lightly touching his hand. "I wanted you to know that this boy will carry his father's story with pride, that he will know where he came from." Edward didn't reply. He just pulled her into a hug, strong and silent. His face was hidden in her neck. When he finally spoke, his voice came out choked. "Thank you for giving me all this without asking for anything in return." Christina wrapped her arms around him, and they stayed there for long, intense minutes, uniting scarred hearts that were finally healing. The months passed like leaves blown by the wind. Christina was no longer just the woman who arrived at that mansion carrying wounds. She was now a living presence, part of the house, the routine of Edward himself. Her belly grew, as did the bond between the two of them. He accompanied her to her appointments, massaged her back at night, read books about fatherhood by her side. He was a changed man. One rainy Saturday, they decided to go out to see if they could buy something else for their trousseau. They went to a luxury shopping centre in central London. Christina walked slowly, wearing a long beige dress and comfortable sandals. Edward followed her, attentive to every step. In the window of a luxury baby store, she turned to comment on something and froze. Charles and Liz, standing there just a few meters away, in front of the same store. Charles's eyes met hers, and he stopped, as if the world had stopped together. Liz, noticing, grabbed his arm, but he didn't move. Christina felt her chest tighten for a moment, not out of longing, not out of love, but for everything she had once been and no longer was. Charles looked at her with wide eyes, analyzing everything. Her elegance, her serenity, her advanced pregnancy. He said nothing, but his eyes shouted, "She won!" Liz, next to him, held her handbag tightly. It was impossible not to feel a pang of jealousy. That child could be his. Christina took a deep breath, lifted her chin. She took Edward's hand. who hadn't noticed anything yet, and without saying a word, she turned to him. She kissed him on the lips lovingly, without haste, with the calm of someone who knows what they have. Edward smiled in surprise and kissed her back. Then he knelt down and kissed her belly lovingly. "Our Henry is getting restless," he said, and they went into the store, leaving behind everything that had once hurt. A few days later, dawn came full of tension and emotion. Christina woke up with a strong cramp, different from the previous ones. It was time. Edward was quick, almost instinctive, as if he had been trained for the moment. He helped her with firmness and delicacy at the same time, picked up the ready-made suitcase from beside the bed, and minutes later, the car was driving through the silent streets of London towards the hospital. In the passenger seat, Christina took a deep breath, her hands trembling over the belly she was carrying with so much love and hope. She felt fear, yes, but she also felt courage, a silent strength that was growing inside her, as if Henrique himself was saying, "It's going to be all right, Mama." Hours of labor. The room, illuminated by the cold light of dawn, contrasted with the heat of the moment. Tears flowed, sweat on her forehead, hands clenched, restrained cries. The doctor became firmer every minute. "You're doing very well, Christina. Just a little longer." And there, by her side, Edward, tireless, with his eyes glued to her, as if she were the miracle he had never dared to ask for. "I'm here," he always said. "I won't let go. Never again." And then, the cry, the sound that changed everything. Henrique was born at 4:27 in the morning, strong, red, so small and so whole. His eyes were still closed, but his heart was open to the world. Christina cried like never before. It was an ancestral cry, of relief, of love, of new beginnings. "My God, my love, you're so perfect." Edward knelt beside the bed, his hands in her wet hair, stroking it as if to say thank you. "He has your nose," he said, smiling and crying at the same time. "And his chin," she replied, her eyes watery and bright. The doctor watched them in silence, smiling. It was beautiful to see the birth of a child, but it was even more beautiful to witness the birth of a family. In the morning, in the hospital room, Henrique was sleeping peacefully in the crib next to him. Christina was lying down, her eyes tired but full of light. Edward sat down next to her and held her hand. "I didn't know how much I needed you," he said in a whisper that seemed to come from the soul. Christina looked at him tenderly. "And I didn't know I could be loved like this, with so much silence and so much truth." He leaned over and kissed her on the forehead, closing his eyes for a moment, as if sealing an eternal pact. "Now there are 3 of us, and nothing, absolutely nothing, will keep us apart." The door opened softly with a gentle knock. Margaret walked in with an arrangement of white flowers in her arms and a thrilled smile on her face. "I've come to see my little prince and his queen." Christina smiled, tired but full. "He's there, sleeping like an angel." Margaret went over to the crib, watched Henry with a twinkle in her eye, and then turned her gaze back to the couple. "You have no idea how much all this makes me believe in love again. Time has passed. With it, so did the seasons." London blossomed as the Harrington mansion was transformed, not just in decoration but in soul. The once silent corridors now echoed with the laughter of a baby learning to smile. Henry was growing fast, and every day Christina and Edward discovered more about the world, not the world outside, but the one between them. Their complicity deepened. Their glances said more than 1,000 promises. Christina started painting again. She turned one of the rooms into a studio, and Edward filled it with easels, paint, fresh flowers, and open windows. He said she was even more beautiful there, brush in hand and eyes shining. She said he was even more beautiful when he was with Henry on his lap, telling made-up stories or dancing awkwardly on the balcony just to make him laugh. One cold autumn afternoon, as they walked through the gardens with the baby wrapped in a blue blanket, Christina suddenly stopped. "Have you noticed," she said, looking at him, "that we've become exactly what seemed impossible to me?" Edward squeezed her fingers. "I never doubted us. I did. So many times. And yet you came. And yet you stayed." She hugged him tightly, and there, amidst the golden leaves, they swore their love in silence. Later that day, as they dined in the garden with a simple table, wine and candles, Edward watched her in silence for a few seconds. "Christina, will you marry me?" She stopped, the soup spoon in the air, the smile hesitating on her lips. "What do you mean?" "I want to marry you, not because we have to, but because I love you, with everything, with all the pain you've brought, with all the scars we've shared, with all the dreams we're still going to dream." Christina began to cry. "Are you sure?" "The only certainty in my life." She laughed through her tears. "Then yes." And there, amidst flowers, stars, and the baby sleeping on Margaret's lap, the two of them sealed another promise. The wedding took place weeks later, simple, intimate, full of soul. Emma was the maid of honor. Henrique, on Margaret's lap, carried the rings, which read, "I'm a nanny, a foster grandmother, and now a wedding planner too." Christina wore a flowing dress with an open back, her hair loose and her eyes happier than they had ever been. Edward wore a navy blue suit, and that smile she had learned to recognize as pure love. As they exchanged vows, she said, "I didn't choose everything that happened to me, but I chose to go on, and choosing you was the most beautiful part of my survival." He replied, "You and Henrique are the home I never knew I was looking for." That night in the illuminated mansion, they danced slowly with Henry in their arms among candles and old songs. And when everyone left, Edward lay next to Christina, with his son asleep in the cradle. Life is sometimes generous. Very. She rested her head on his chest. "But do you know what I like most about us?" "You know what I like most about us? That we started out imperfectly, but we built something perfect out of it. Outside the mansion, the world went on as usual. But inside, where love had overcome all pain, time seemed to have found its place. Christina, Edward, and Henrique, a family born of the unexpected, but which remained by choice, by surrender, and above all, for love." What did you think of the story? Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to receive our stories firsthand and also see this exciting story on screen.